All right, so let's get started on the presentation. So last Saturday we had a class about pruning fruit trees and grapes as well. This class is going to be a little bit different because pruning ornamentals is just, it's a different kind of practice than pruning fruit trees and things. So I have a couple of fruit trees there on the left side, but pruning can be seen as both a science and an art, as we can see. So again, pruning fruit trees is going to be a lot different than pruning ornamentals. And then in the middle there is a specialty type of pruning that you can do with fruit trees or other trees, that it becomes more a little bit artsy, right? So there's different ways of pruning for different things. And I first wanted to start out with tools that you're going to need. And I also have these in person too, so I'm going to stand up here. And then I'll talk about, I'll talk about all the tools first, and then I'll show you them in person. So the first one is there on the very left. Those are hand pruners. Those ones are going to be used for stems that are 1/2 inch wide or less. And then down at the bottom right, we have loppers, and those are going to be used for stems that are 2 inches wide down to 1/2 inch, right? Because those hand pruners are the 1/2 inch. And then the very top picture, that's a hand saw, and those are for stems that are 4 inches or less. And anything bigger than that, you're probably going to want an electric saw, but hopefully with ornamentals, we're not having to prune with an ornamental saw or with an electric saw or a gas powered saw, something that's going to really cut through those big branches. Hopefully with ornamentals, you're not cutting bigger branches than these sizes. So then I'm going to switch my screen. There we go. So stop share. Okay. So you should be able to see just me now. So now I'm going to show you all those, just kind of the ones that we have for the garden. So these are the hand pruners. You can see they pretty much fit in the hand, which is why they're called that. And we have the loppers, and these ones, you can see that they're, here we go. So they're a bit bigger, and these are really nice, especially for if you're pruning roses, because then you can reach down into the rose bush without having to get your hands in there and dealing with the thorns. Those are loppers. And then we have a couple of different types of hand saws. So we have this guy, which is just full blade, and then the hand there, and then there's a sheath to keep it in just to keep that blade. But then there's also hand saws that they make that they kind of fold out, which these ones are super nice because you can keep this in like your pocket. And then if you're up in a tree pruning, you can take it out of your pocket and then just open it up and saw away. These are super nice, especially when you're needing to cut branches that are a little bit too hard for loppers. All right, we're going to go back to presentation now. So I'll sit back down here. Okay, let's see. Okay, so those are your tools that you're usually going to need with pruning. And then tool care is actually something that's really important with pruning your, well, any trees, not just ornamentals and shrubs as well. So one thing that's really important to do when pruning trees is disinfecting the blade. This is something that's really good to do at the very beginning of the season, especially if you hadn't done it at all last year. So I mean, right now during the winter time, well, it's getting closer to spring, but this would be a really good time to start disinfecting your blades and getting all of the sap off of them and doing this other tool care. But then also disinfecting the blades is really important to do sometimes during the pruning process, especially if you're pruning off diseased branches. So now I can't remember the name of the disease. There's a it's a disease that you get. Oh, fire blight. That's it. I don't know why that went out of my mind. So fire blight is a really common disease that we see in our crab apples, apple trees, lots of your different trees that have kind of a fruit on it. And so, and there's not a great way to be able to keep the fire blight out of your tree, just because it has to do with the environment and whether or not it rained and temperature and things. So it's kind of a hard thing to prevent from happening in your tree. So it's most likely going to happen. So in your trees that have that, if you're pruning out those diseased branches, which is what you want to do when you see it start affecting the tree, you do want to disinfect your blade before the cut and after, especially after if you're doing other trees and shrubs and things, because the bacteria that comes from that fire blight can transfer from tree to shrub, or from shrub to tree, or tree to tree. So disinfecting your blades is something that's really important to do, especially if you're cutting diseased branches off. So rubbing alcohol is one way that you can disinfect that blade. So you just put rubbing alcohol on like a clean rag or paper towel, and then you just disinfect both sides of the blade, right? And then during the pruning process, it's actually a really good idea to be wiping sap and dirt from the blades before each cut. So if you make a cut, you get a bunch of like tree bark and sap and things on your blades, just kind of take a rag. You can have that rag in your pocket, take it, wipe it down, make your next cut, right? There's not a lot of trees that make a lot of mess. So hopefully that's not something that you're having to do at every single cut, right? But it is something to keep in mind, just because it can help with the spread of diseases. And then following the care instructions from the manufacturers for your tools is something that's really important to do as well. So again, this is something that you can do before you start pruning for the season. So in the wintertime, when you're not really doing anything in your garden, this is a good project for that. So removing rust from your blades, oiling your joints and your springs, and then sharpening the dull edges of your blades. It's really smart to sharpen the edges of your blades every year, because clean cuts makes better healing process for your trees and shrubs. So the bottom picture there, we have our tools, and we have a bunch of things around that help with the tool care, right? So those kind of wire sponge looking things, those can help remove the rust from your blades. Then we have the oils, the 3-in-1 and the 40 or WD-40. Those can help with oiling. The WD-40 is more of like a cleaner thing, so that can also help with rust and things. And then the oil, that's what you'd be putting in your joints and your springs of your, especially your hand pruners. So like with our hand pruners here. So there's our spring, right? You're gonna be wanting to put oil kind of in that area and trying to remove as much of the rust. If these get wet, those springs can rust really easily. And that's another thing, is just making sure that after you use your tools, you're making sure that they're not wet, that you wipe them off, and that they're kept in a place where they're not going to be getting a lot of moisture on them to prevent that rust and things. So now we're going to be getting into pruning. And we need to start with having the correct reasons to prune. So with a fruit tree, your reasons are a little bit different, right? But with your ornamental trees and shrubs, the 3 reasons that you should be pruning are for the health of the tree, if there's a hazard, and then keeping the shape of the tree. Incorrect reasons to prune are that you have extra time to open the tree up, everyone else is doing it right now, and a spring cleanup project. Ornamentals are different than fruit trees. They're not things that need to be pruned back every single year. And so these are the only things that you should be looking for when you're going to prune your ornamentals. If the health of the tree is just fine, if there's not a hazard and the shape of the tree is just fine, you shouldn't be pruning your ornamental trees, right? Ornamental trees don't really need to be opened up. They don't have any like edible fruit that you're going to be growing the tree for. So you're not really needing to create a space for a person to go inside the tree and to be picking fruit or helping the tree to have a little bit more air circulation. Ornamentals don't really need that. So next, before we get into other pruning things, is just kind of the basic tree information. And with ornamental trees, we're going to be going over water sprouts, which you can see kind of there in the middle of the picture. Those are water sprouts. They are branches that grow straight upwards, and it's usually off of a scaffold branch. And then we're going to be going over suckers as well, and those are at the bottom near the trunk, and those will come from the ground. So just remember, suckers are from the ground, water sprouts are from the branches. And I think pretty much those two are the only ones that we're going to be going over with ornamentals. Yeah, so those, the water sprouts and the suckers, I just wanted to make sure that we understood where those were placed in regards to the tree, because we will be going over those. So next is, what are we pruning on ornamentals? So, I mean, we talked about the reasons to prune, but what are we actually pruning on the tree? So we have dead or dying material. So that's something that once a tree is starting to kind of leaf out, or you can tell that a branch is broken or dead, you're wanting to get that pruned out as soon as possible, just to help so that that broken branch doesn't fall on somebody, or just to so that you can start seeing what you're going to do with the tree after that branch is gone. So like in the top right corner, I have a picture there of a nice looking tree, and it has a very large dead branch in there. This tree looks like it's in a yard, and that branch is over a grass area, right? So that branch needs to go as soon as possible, because if it gets any, if it starts to give and then there's enough weight on it, it can actually break itself, and it could end up falling on somebody or an animal or something. So you'd want to get that branch out of there. Branches that are crossing, I have an example of that down in the bottom of the middle picture. So that's not ideal to have branches that are crossing like that. The tree will eventually actually grow over that, the crossing branches. It'll kind of create a little area, but the problem with that is you have open area inside this little kind of ball that the tree will create around those crossing branches. And this can create a spot for bacteria to be growing, just because there's open space in there. And then it also can create problems with decay and things, and then those branches can eventually fail due to decay and disease inside that area. So you're not wanting your branches to be crossing. Cutting out your suckers or your water sprouts. So I have suckers there on the bottom right. Those are suckers. Notice how it's at the base of the tree. So you're wanting to prune those out. And then water sprouts, I have an example up at the top next to the tree with the dead branch on the left side. So those are water sprouts. So you're wanting to prune those guys out. And then small branches from the inside of the tree, branches that aren't really doing much, you can prune out. I mean, like I have an example of this over on the very left side. So, I mean, along with this is branches that are growing in the wrong direction. This picture kind of referred to both. So over on the bottom left picture, there's that like teeny tiny branch. Branch isn't really doing anything for the shape of the tree. And if it's not going to be doing anything for you, if you feel like that's something that you want to prune out, you can. But then also this branch is growing in the wrong direction. It's growing towards the trunk of the tree. So not ideal, just because that's not the way the branches should be growing. So you'd want to prune those guys out. So next we're going to be going over some different techniques with pruning. And these refer more to your bigger branches in your ornamental trees. But first we need to kind of go over some things to identify so that we know we're on the kind of the same page. of what we're talking about. So over on the right, I'm going to be, or on the left side, I'm going to be showing some areas that are important to recognize on a tree when you're pruning. So being circled right now, that's the branch bark ridge. And then we're going to be having this part outlined. This is the branch collar. And both of these things are really important to know because you don't want to be cutting into those parts of the tree at all. They're really important to the tree health and the healing process of the tree. So when you're making a cut, so if we're going to be cutting off that branch there, we're going to be cutting from point A to point B. And it's going to be an angle that is down and out. So then there on the right side is a different tree, and we can see the branch bark ridge there, and we can see the branch collar. You're not wanting to cut into the branch collar or the branch bark ridge at all, but you don't want to leave a stub. And we're going to be going over that as well. So here's a technique that you can use for those bigger branches. And it goes along with the branch bark ridge as well as the branch collar. So when you're pruning a large branch, it's really important not to go straight to that branch collar and make that cut, just because that can actually sometimes, if the branch is really heavy, it can create a tear in the tree, which is a lot worse for the tree health. So you want to do this 3-part cut pruning technique. So I have over on the right side an example there. You have your branch. You can see in that picture, you can see the branch bark ridge and you can see the collar, right? So your first cut is going to be a ways away, and you're going to make that on the underside of the branch, and you're going up about 1/3. So you cut with your, usually these cuts are made with saws. So with your hand saw, you're cutting up 1/3, right? And then you go to the top of the branch, move over a little bit, cut down 2/3, and then usually the weight of the branch will take those 2 cuts and it'll create a stub. So now you have a smaller area to be able to go back to the branch collar, making sure not to cut into the collar, just right outside it, make your final 3rd cut. And now you have a nice looking pruning cut, right? And then there's things that you want to avoid doing. So we have a couple of pictures there that give a good example for like conifers, so your evergreens, trees like your spruces and your pines, and then our broadleaves, ornamentals. And it's showing you where the branch bark ridge is, where the branch collar is. It's showing the correct way to prune. And then some other techniques with that is you're wanting to remove as much of the branch as you can, but you need to be really careful. So you don't want to cut flush to the trunk, meaning if this is your trunk and you have your branch here, right? Trunk, branch. You're not wanting to cut all the way to the trunk. Cutting flush to the trunk is going to be cutting straight up and down, right? Now we have our branch here. We're going to be wanting to cut like that way. We don't want to cut flush to the trunk. I'll show you some pictures later on why that's not good. It really does not do good for the tree. It can actually end up killing it if you end up doing that. So you don't want to cut flush to the tree, and you also don't want to leave a stub. So again, if we have our trunk here, branch, if we cut over here and now we have a little stub here, right? My fingers are the stub. That's also gonna not be good for the healing process. And I'll show you why. You're wanting to make natural target cuts. So from that branch bark ridge to the branch collar, we can see the branch collar, branch bark ridge, pretty much in between those is where we're cutting from A to B in all of those pictures, the pictures that we have there, right? Again, leaving a bump, not a stub. So a little bump is fine, but a stub is not fine. And then making the cut to slant, down and out. And so I'm going to show you, these are first incorrect pruning cuts on ornamental trees here. So we have a variety. We have the branches being cut flush to the tree there on the left. And then moving over to the right, we have stubs being left. We have they're cutting into the branch collar there on the next picture. And the next picture again is they've like cut into the trunk of the tree. Those are not correct pruning cuts, and it's really going to affect the tree later. These are correct pruning cuts. So we have over on the left side some loppers being used. You can see that the cut is being made fairly close, but not so close that they're being flush to the branch or the trunk. And then their cut is looking like it's going to be a really clean cut there. Next, moving over, we have a correct looking bump. That's the bump that you're looking for. And then we have the guy at the bottom. He's made that 3-point cut, you can see, because it looks like the branch was able to break off so that it didn't tear the tree. And then he's cutting outside of that branch collar from branch bark ridge to the collar. He's making that correct cut there. And then again, we have correct examples of bumps left, not steps. And so now we're going to go to the healing wounds. So incorrect healing processes are shown there on the right side. So we have a stub that was left. So you can see that that tree is really struggling to heal because it has all of that branch that it's trying to heal over. So it takes a really long time to try to cover that entire branch with bark, trying to finish the healing process. But the problem with that is that it having that stub there, and that stub is dying, right? Because it's been cut off. And it's now a place for disease to get into and insects. And we have this decaying branch that the tree is trying to heal over quickly, but it's not able to do that because it's taking so long for the tree to slowly grow up around the stub, right? So you never want to leave a stub just because of this picture here. And then cutting flush to the tree is shown there in the bottom. And I mean, it's not healing correctly. You can see that. You can see this tree is been trying to heal over that cut for a long time. But the problem is when you cut into that branch collar, you're cutting off the cells that kind of regrow around that's the bump that's left there. And so if you cut flush, it's not able to correctly heal all the way around that wound. And then there on the left side of that picture, we have a correct healing process. That's what you should see when you've made a cut. Over the next few years, your tree should be making that kind of perfect little circle around your wound, because it's closing up really nicely and it's able to do that a little like fairly quickly. But that's the correct healing process. And then with that healing process, it is best to let the wounds heal in the open air. Your wound dressings are needed. A lot of people, I used to work at a nursery in Logan, and a lot of people would come in and ask me if we had like glue or something for them to put over a pruning cut. And I was like, I don't think so. And there are like some things that you can use, but they're not needed. It is best to let the tree heal to that open air. There is an exception that I found in one of my books that if it's a summer wound, if you're in like extreme hot and dry conditions, you can wrap it in those hot and dry conditions if you made that cut. But you do want to make sure that you remove that wound like wrap. You don't ever want to put like a substance on it, but you can maybe wrap something around it. But you should remove that within 2 to 3 weeks. So you don't want to keep it on there for very long, but during those like really hot and dry conditions, sometimes it is okay to have kind of like a wrap on that wound. So next we're going to go over some shrub pruning techniques, a little bit different than your trees because shrubs don't have those giant branches and things, right? But it's kind of similar in the angle of the cut. So correct cut is there on the left. It's a 45-degree angle. You can see the little bud that's left. So you're not wanting to get too close to that bud, which is shown in that middle example, the too low of a cut. You don't want to get too close to that bud. You want to be a little bit above it. But you need to make sure that your angle isn't too angled. You don't want to do just like a stub cut. But then if you have buds on the opposite sides, you can make a cut that's a good amount of height above those buds, right? And so that's kind of what you're looking for when you're pruning branches in a shrub. And then some different techniques with pruning shrubs. There's a few different like type of pruning with shrubs. So there's natural shaping pruning, there's rejuvenating, hedging, capicing, and pollarding. I guess pollarding is more of like a tree technique, but they're kind of grouped. I've grouped capicing and pollarding in there because those are more specialty pruning techniques. So we're not going to be going over them a ton other than the fact that they are a technique that can be used. So a natural shaping of a shrub is pretty easy. I've done this a few times with different shrubs that have gotten too big for the homeowner, and they haven't wanted to like chop it, but they wanted to keep it looking really nice. So to do that, you don't ever want to just like take a hedge trimmer and saw it off, right? You do it, it's a really slow process. It's something that you're wanting to do and make a cut, step back, look, see how it looks, go back, make other cuts. But you're wanting to make sure that you're pruning down to like the buds, and then also be aware of where those buds are next going to be growing. So on the top example there, they're making a cut and there's a bud facing inward. So that branch is now going to be growing inward, right? On the bottom, they cut, the bud is facing outward. So that new branch is going to be growing outward. So just making sure that you're paying attention to where the buds are if you're making the natural shaping pruning cuts, right? Next is a rejuvenating pruning process. And this is like pretty much starting over with the shrub. And only specific shrubs can do this. I have a couple of examples that are really good with this. Lilacs are also another actually really good one. But if you have a shrub and you're like, I really want to like start over with the shrub, it's something you're going to want to make sure that you look up before you make the cuts. But the rejuvenating process, so there's a drastic way to do it, and then there's kind of more of a gradual way. So drastic way, you go down 6 inches to the ground, like ground 6 inches, and you just chop the entire thing down. Really drastic, right? But we actually did this with my parents' lilac bushes, and they've done really well. They were just getting quite large because they're lilacs, or they're a specific type of lilac that gets to be really big, and my parents didn't like that. So I was like, well, let's do this rejuvenating growth, and then you can control the size better. Whether or not they're going to control the size better, I don't know. But so you just chop it all off and then it'll grow back. The thing about this is that it will, when you've done that, sometimes it doesn't flower the first year that it's coming back up. So you do want to kind of keep that in mind. A gradual renewal pruning is that you remove 1/4 to 1/2 of those branches to 6 inches above the ground, and then the next year you remove the rest. So that's a pretty gradual process. It's not a complete like chop down of the shrub. It's really gradual, and that is sometimes helpful for people that are more nervous doing that thing. But then again, I say make sure that you're checking the kind of shrub that you're wanting to do that to and seeing if it's going to be able to do that kind of a cut. Next is hedging, and there are 2 different types of hedges you can have. You can have a formal hedge or an informal hedge, and there are specific plants that do better with formal versus informal. So I have examples of a formal hedge there on the left side. Top picture is boxwoods, bottom picture is a yew, and those for formal hedges, those are the ones that you're taking your hedge trimmer and you're kind of creating shapes with, right? You can do circles, you can do square shape, you're kind of shaping it to look a little bit more boxy. That's your formal hedge. And some other plants that do really well with that are your hollies and your privets. They're okay kind of being shaped like that every year. For informal hedges, I have examples of those on the right side of the pictures, and we have viburnums on the top. I'm pretty sure those are viburnums, and then on the bottom it's lilacs. And these ones, you just kind of let them be their natural shape, and they create a really nice looking hedge. So these ones you don't want to be taking your hedge trimmer to and kind of trimming it to your own look, because these can create a really dense hedge for you without you having to trim it off. And other ones that do well for this are yews, and then Chinese junipers as well do really well. So yews can work for both your formal and your informal. But again, just remember, formal hedging, you're shaping it. Informal hedging, you're letting it kind of be its natural shape as a hedge. Both look really nice. And then capicing and pollarding. So pollarding is more on trees. Capicing is more for your shrubs. Again, I'm not going to go over these a ton just because they are more specialty. You don't want to be doing this unless you really know what you're doing, because they are really specialty types of pruning. But just be aware that they're there, and that's kind of what the shrub and tree end up looking like. So, but again, these are a little bit more difficult ways of pruning and not really for everyday ornamental trees. I don't know. They're just, and shrubs, they're just a little bit more of a specialty type of pruning that not a lot of people use. And then I'm going to go over a little bit about pruning roses. We did have a rose class on this past Wednesday, and that presentation is going to be going up on our website, and the recording should be going up here pretty soon. So if you have any other questions about roses, I really suggest that you go back and look through those slides and then watch the video as well, because we had Sheridan from the USU Extension teach that class. She's very knowledgeable. It was an awesome class. But these are pretty much just the basics of rose bush pruning. So prune during dormancy. I mean, pretty much anything is best to prune during dormancy. And then the reasons to prune your roses is to remove the dead wood, to promote growth, removing the canes that are growing like kind of inward, those awkward canes, and then removing the dumb canes, the ones that are dying, the ones that are crossing, right? And then another thing is that when you're pruning during dormancy, you're wanting to remove 1/3 to 1/2 of the height of your rose bush. So in my example there, I have an unpruned one and then a pruned one. You can see that they took about 1/3 down in the height there. And then you want to leave about 5 to 12 canes, which is shown in that example as well. The pruned one, there's 6 canes there, I believe. And then you want them to be 1.5 foot to 2 feet tall. And then you want the center of the plant to be kept open. It is going to grow a lot. Some people don't realize how much roses will grow within a season. And so, I mean, that looks pretty sparse there, but don't worry, that rose will fill out and it'll be beautiful. Again, if you have more questions about roses, make sure to go reference that presentation and video from Sheridan. And then I just gave an example there, the cut that you would make next to a bud. So again, that bud is going to be growing. So you're going to make that pruning cut above the bud, not too close, at a 45-degree angle. And then that's the way that branch is going to end up going, right? Okay. So next we're going to be talking about timing of pruning. So this is the same for pretty much everything, but the best time is going to be in late winter or early spring. So like right now is a really good time to start pruning your fruit trees and your ornamentals and your shrubs. And it's before the buds fall. You don't want to prune off your new buds. So the ones that are, their energy are getting put into them, right? And this is just, it's the best time to prune. I mean, in Maui right now, it's snowing, so today's not the best day, but other days in the week are supposed to be really sunny and nice. And so you can start getting out there to prune. And then also just note that some trees do bleed, but the bleeding should stop within a couple of days and shouldn't be a problem. So if you notice that there's like droplets coming out of the wounds, it shouldn't be a problem. Especially with sappy plants, you'll see that a lot. Worst time to prune is late spring. This is the active growth period. You don't want to be cutting off your new leaves and buds, things that the tree's putting energy into at that moment, right? And it's going to be promoting growth So if you're pruning during the growth period, it's just going to take off and just be like super crazy. And then also during this time, the bark is really tender and can easily be damaged. So if you're pruning during that time, even if your blades are sharp, sometimes the bark is so tender that you'll be pruning and then it won't go all the way through. So then you'll have this kind of like ragged ended looking cut, which is not good for the health of the tree. There is an exception, of course, as always. Some of your super duper early spring blooming shrubs can be pruned back after they're done blooming. It encourages more blooms in the next year, is what I read in my book. I haven't seen this done, and I don't think it makes that much of a difference, like as far as I've seen, but the book did mention that that was something that could be done. Forsythia and lilacs are a really good example of your really early spring bloomers. And then the next worst time to prune is fall. And it's because that the wounds received from pruning can more easily be infected because you're getting into the colder temperatures, the tree's kind of starting to start going into dormancy. So it's just not the best time to be pruning. It's needing to harden off branches and focus on getting itself ready. So pruning during that time isn't the best. Risky time to prune is summer. And it's because it can stimulate growth, giving it not enough time possibly for it to harden off before winter. That can cause winter damage. And then sometimes with your hot and dry conditions, if you're pruning in the summertime, it can cause the surrounding tissue around the wound to start dying back. So you just want to be really careful. And of course, there's an exception. You want to prune to control excessive growth and water sprouts. So if you have water sprouts coming up in the summer, you're good to prune those out. You just want to be really careful that you're not pruning during an extremely hot period of time, and that it's more towards the beginning of the summer rather than the end, so the tree has enough time to harden off the new growth that comes from that. Also an exception to all those times is the fact that trees can be damaged, which I think we go over here. So damage happens. It's just inevitable with some trees, and especially in areas where there's really high winds, damage happens. And as soon as that damage happens, you're wanting to prune those damaged branches out as soon as possible, just to kind of create a better healing process for the tree, and then also to prevent anyone from getting hurt with the branch breaking off itself. And then it also can help with insect and disease problems from those wounds. And then when planting a tree, you're only wanting to prune out your dead and your broken branches. So you buy a tree from the store, right? Plant it in the ground. It's already going to be a little bit stressed because it's trying to establish. So don't go making huge cuts on it. I suggest waiting, but if there's any broken or dead branches on the tree, you can prune them out, but just don't prune a ton because that tree's already trying to focus on rooting into the ground. So don't be pruning your ornamental trees. Fruit trees, again, fruit trees are a little bit different. They can be pruned a little bit more heavily, but with your ornamentals, there's just not a lot to prune on them usually. And then we've already talked about this, but pruning early when the tree, oh, no, we haven't talked about this. Pruning early in the season, yes, very good. But pruning early in the tree's life. So you bought a tree, it's still pretty young, plant it in the ground, let it establish for like a year and a half, and then you can start shaping it. It's so much better to prune that tree back when it's young so that you're not having to make giant cuts when it's bigger, right? So making sure to kind of train that tree from when it's young to be the shape that you're wanting it to be when it's getting bigger. This can really help with other problems later, and it can also help. Usually you're not making those giant cuts and you need to get a saw, like an electric saw, to make a giant cut. So pruning when the tree is younger than when it's older is something that's really important. And then how much should you prune on your ornamentals? You shouldn't be having to make that much of a difference in your ornamental tree and shrub. But if you feel like you do like have a ton of dead branches, or it's something that hasn't been pruned forever and there's a lot of dying material in there, you just want to make sure that you stick to the 1/3 rule, which means that you don't ever want to prune off more than 1/3 of your tree each year. And then there's also the 1/3 rule with large branches. So if you're needing to take out a large branch out of an ornamental tree, you want to look at another branch next to it. If the branch you're wanting to take off is more than 1/3 the size of your trunk, you don't want to take it off. You want your trunk to be able to be big enough to deal with that wound, right? And then, so with that 1/3 rule, it's like 20 to 25% of the leaves type of deal. But with ornamentals, you're not really wanting to take off a ton of leaves off of your trees and shrubs, right? And then we're gonna talk about topping real fast, which is something that's done quite often. We see it all the time. It's done a lot around like power lines and things. And this is not the best. It's not good for the tree health. They leave stubs with topping. That's how topping is different than other types of pruning. Regrowth is extremely fast because that tree has been sheared off, and now it's like, oh no, I've been sheared off, and so it shoots out all of this growth, and they're having to do it every year. So if you ever see a tree that they've topped and then there's power lines, they're going to be continually topping that tree the rest of its life. Better solutions with power lines is doing a directional pruning. So you have a tree here, right? Pretty beautiful tree, power line up there. And they're like, okay, we need to cut this tree so that it's not hitting the power lines. You can shape the tree so that it's kind of growing around the power line. So the power line's going this way. We now have this tree that's kind of shaped around that power line, right? Best way to do that is you're going to go from your branch that you want to be removed, go to the tip of a connecting healthy branch that's growing in the correct direction, and then you do a correct cut down to there, right? But the best solution is to plant a tree that won't get too tall. If you have power lines in your neighborhood and you're wanting to plant a tree and you have a power line above the area where you're planting your tree, make sure that you know the height of that and that you know how big that tree is going to get. Otherwise, you're going to be continually pruning back that tree for the rest of its life and the rest of your life. It'll just make life easier for everybody, right? And then you'll still be able to have a beautiful tree that won't affect the power lines. And then the last thing I want to go over is safety. Using a ladder and using it correctly. So there on the left side, that's a big no. Do not do that. Not good for the guy like hedging. It looks like they're doing a hedge, and not good for the guy who's holding the ladder. Not safe. So use a ladder, right? But use it correctly. And making sure that when you're cutting out those big branches, making sure that there's no one around in your yard, no animals, no people. And then when you're cutting those bigger branches, and then making sure to like yell out branch coming down or look out below, just making sure that your area is safe before you make the cut. And then if there's power lines involved at all, you'd want to call a professional. We don't want people climbing up in their trees with power lines and getting electrocuted. You can probably go out there and say, hey, like, I want this tree to be shaped this way. I don't want you to just top it. But call a professional, arborist and people that know what they're doing when dealing with power lines. And then I just have the resources that I used. Again, these slides are going to be put up on our website, so you'll be able to get these resources. You don't have to hurry and write them down real fast. So you can go back and reference those, but these have been really helpful for me. And I hope that this presentation was good for you. Again, pruning ornamentals is not as extensive as pruning fruit trees and vines and fruiting things. It's a little bit more simple, but I don't know, I hope this gave you some good tips and some good information, but that's my presentation for now. And if there's other questions you think I should go over, Dave, let's do those.
I've answered, excuse me, I got something in my throat. So I've answered most of these. There were some good questions, and maybe a few things just relevant to everybody. About shrubs. You talked about some shrubs, and there were several questions about cutting shrubs all the way to the ground or leaving them over the course of a couple of years. So generally for everybody, if you're worried about shrubs, do a quick search. You can do a quick internet search. I mean, because we wouldn't have slides or information to cover every single shrub in depth. But most shrubs are fairly aggressive growers, and they'll do fine cutting them completely to the ground. But some are not. If you cut them to the ground, you're going to kill it. And so if you don't know what you have or something, try to identify that. You could send us an email with some pictures. We could maybe try to help you identify that and then help you know what to do. But it's hard to answer that question because I'm not sure what everybody has. So it's like, oh, I have this big shrub, should I cut it down? Well, if you don't know what it is, that's the first step. And then you can decide if you can cut it completely down and reinvigorate it, or just slowly take some of the large branches out to invigorate growth. But for the most part, there's no additional questions. I should mention before everybody jumps off, this class has been recorded, and the recording and the slides will be online. And so that's going to be helpful for everyone. Actually, can you see the questions coming in now? There are a few questions. Do you want to just read them?
Yeah. Let's see. So we have one. I have lilacs that are now trees. Can I cut it down? Typically lilacs are good. If it's a lilac tree, I wouldn't. But if they were shrubs in the beginning and they've grown to be like, 12 feet tall, they should be good to be cut down to the ground. That's how my parents were. Some of those older lilac varieties do get to be kind of that 12 to 15 feet tall type of shrub. And usually they're good to be cut down, again, 6 inches above the soil. That's a complete regenerative growth. If you're nervous about cutting it down that much, do those like a fourth to a half of the branches out, and then do the next fourth to a half the next year. So it should be fine. But if it's a lilac tree, I wouldn't do that. But if it's a shrub that's kind of gotten tall enough that it's like, it seems more like a tree, it should be fine to be cut down. Hopefully I was able to answer that okay. What is the best way to do globe catalpa trees? The wood is so brittle that our branches break off periodically, and then the tree is mishappen. Is it best to trim it back all around? I don't have a ton of experience with the globe catalpa trees. Dave, do you have any other experience with that one?
Yeah, this is one of those cases where the pruning technique is kind of called pollarding. I mean, to do it properly, you take the branches way down, and it's a big tree, but you can keep them very small. You've seen these around. Some people do this, and your catalpa gets really bushy, really thick and dense, but it's really short and globe shaped, kind of rounded. It's just aggressive pruning where you're taking the main branches down, and then every year you kind of cut back to that same point. It's a lot of heading cuts at first, and then you get a lot of new growth, and then you have to take that new growth off every year, and then you keep it in this shape. But you don't want to, maybe do just a couple of quick internet searches for that to see some examples and get a little bit of picture in your mind, because you don't cut it necessarily all the way down. There are some places where you'd want to make the cuts a little better. But if you have a very large catalpa tree, or you just want to keep it trained that way, you can do those heading cuts and then start stimulating growth. And that's one of those little bit more of a specialty type thing, but you see it around. People do it. So I would recommend just doing a couple quick little internet searches, and you can see how that's done.
Awesome. Thanks, Dave. Next question is, what is the best way to prune 9 bark? I mean, it would depend on what you're wanting to do with it, right? Nine barks themselves, they actually do have a really beautiful natural shape to them. And so the only thing that I've ever pruned out of nine barks is kind of like a water sprout type of a growth, which if you have your kind of dark purple nine barks, you'll see a water sprout as like a really fast growth that'll come in the middle of the shrub that's like bright green. And so that's pretty much the only thing that I've pruned out of nine barks. Otherwise, like I've kept them as their beautiful natural shape just because that's like that's how they want to grow. So why do anything else, right? So I mean, it depends on how you're wanting to prune it. If it's getting too big, you kind of I would suggest doing the natural cuts. It's hard because it's always going to want to go to the size that it's wanting to grow to. So if you have a shrub that's too big for the area, you're going to be continually pruning it back to be the size that you want it to be. But I would keep it as a natural shaping pruning, kind of going back to the buds and seeing where the branch is going to be growing and cutting back to that point. Again, with natural shaping, you want to make a cut, step back, kind of take a look, decide where to do your next cut, make that cut. It's very much a stepping back and looking process to make sure the shrub doesn't look funny when you've been making cuts all over it, right? Keeping that natural shape is important with shrubs. So Jamie, or Levi, whichever one, it depends on how you're wanting it to look, right? But I would suggest a natural shaping pruning would be best for a nine bark. Next question.
Hattie,
Yeah.
really quick. There's one of the attendees, Jen, you have your hand up, but we don't usually use that because of the muting and different options. So if you do the raise your hand button, if you'll just please type the question in the Q&A box, then we can answer that because of the way the webinar is set up. So Jen, if you'll do that, we'll answer questions. And then regarding let me just throw in one little thing, Hattie, with maybe a general rule for a lot of people that are wondering about shrubs. Some shrubs come up kind of as a central trunk, and then just above the ground, they branch out and then they form the shrub. If other shrubs kind of come up as multiple trunks, and then they grow and it looks like you've got all kinds of trunks coming out. A lot of times that may help you know what to do with it. If it's more of a central one trunk, you usually don't want to cut the thing completely down. If it's a bunch of multiple trunks, like dogwood or lilac or those are generally the ones that you can just really cut them down completely to the ground every year if you wanted, and they'll regrow very easily. But that's kind of just a very general rule. You still kind of want to double check some things with that.
Yeah, but no, that's a good point to make, because that is true. I have seen that a lot of the examples that I give in my book were that kind of distinction. But yeah, always double check. But that's a really good point to make, Dave. Yeah, thank you. Next question: how can I safely prune a lavender bush? Good question. Lavender bushes, pruning with these guys is kind of interesting because they don't necessarily get to be really big. The biggest I've ever seen a lavender bush is like 3 feet, I think, 3 foot tall by 3 foot wide. And so the only pruning really that I've done with lavender bushes is just pruning the flowers and the flower stems off to make room for the next ones, right? So the thing with them is that they're kind of half perennial, half shrub, because they have that flower on the top and then they have the woody growth on the bottom. So when you're pruning off those flowers, if that's what you're talking about, is you just want to make sure not to cut into that woody growth. But if you're needing to kind of prune some dead stuff out of the lavender bush, because that can happen, that like a branch will die, you just want to go back to the growing point of where it's dead. So if we have a lavender bush here, right, if this side of the lavender bush is dead, go back to the point where it's dead and cut it as close to like the trunk as possible, right? Those are ones you don't want to be like chopping all the way to the ground. Their lavender bushes are really unique in that they are also semi-evergreen, so they will usually keep some of their leaves during the winter, so they won't do well with that regenerative growth. But you can take the flowers off but you just want to make sure not to cut into that woody growth, because a lot of the times it doesn't really need a woody growth prune unless you have some dead branches. So hopefully that answered that question. Okay.
Let me add one little thing to that
Yeah,
too,
go
Hedging.
ahead.
I've seen people on lavender cut those way down. Timing of the year makes a big difference if you really want to get aggressive with them, because they are woody, and you can get some regenerated growth if it's just really old and scraggly looking. But the timing of that is to do it. Don't do it in the fall. Do it in the spring, and do be careful. You can't go right down to a single trunk. You have to still leave some branching out there.
Yeah.
And rejuvenate it probably slower if you really need to rejuvenate it. But like Hattie Ann said, you really can't. You don't want to be super aggressive necessarily every year, cutting way down into that woody tissue. But I've seen people do it and then they come back. But I also seen people do it and they kill their lavender.
Yeah.
So
kind of a
just
gamble.
be very cautious there. Yeah, and prune, maybe just do it phases a little time. Cut it back a bit, and then the next year maybe a little more, so that you're not doing one massive aggressive cutting that just stresses it out and kills your lavender.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the next question, what is the best way to do a butterfly bush? Again, this is like really similar to the 9-bar question. It depends on what you're wanting to do with it. Butterfly bushes, I've seen, like, they're one of the ones you can do a complete regenerative growth with. But I've also seen people not do that. I've seen people leave them and they do just fine also. So, I mean, if it's getting too big for the area, I would say do a natural cut or a regenerative cut and just rejuvenate it every year. That one, it grows back pretty easily, but otherwise just kind of let it be. Like a lot of ornamentals and trees, they don't really need a lot of work done on them. So if it's looking good every year, you don't really need to do much for them. Do you have any other tips on that, Dave?
Yeah, some of it. Butterfly bush is an interesting aggressive shrub. There are a couple varieties of butterfly bush though that actually stay quite small. And so those are the ones you kind of, depending on the size of the shrub you want, you don't have to do a lot. You'll thin it out a little bit. You'll get some branches going the wrong direction. But I have a butterfly bush and it gets big. It'll grow 6 to 8 feet every year. And so I prefer to keep it kind of rejuvenated and a little fresher. And I cut mine to the ground every single year. But that's personal preference, just to the size you want and so forth. You can leave them growing and they'll get quite large and woody and so forth. But that it all comes to personal preference on those, honestly. They can tolerate a really aggressive cut it to the ground every year type prune.
Yeah, thank you. It's good to know that you have personal experience with that as well. Yeah, hopefully that helped answer that question. And then we have one more. We bought the house with the lilacs that are 12 feet tall. Is there a way to tell if it's a bush or a tree? I mean, I'd go back to what Dave had said about kind of that branching and then more of a trunk type of look. Lilac trees it's pretty easy to tell if it's a tree or not. Lilac bushes, typically they do have the multiple branches coming out of the bottom. So, I mean, that's the way that you would tell whether or not it has like single trunk or if it has all those branches coming out of the ground. If that doesn't clarify it for you, Jen, you can definitely send me an email or Dave with a picture of it, and we can kind of help you a little bit more on identifying what is going to be best for the lilacs that you have.
And I would suspect that it's probably just the large lilac shrub if it's only 12 feet tall. I mean, there's a lilac tree that's nice. Most of the time you see those as a single leader tree and they look like a tree. If these are just giant shrubs that are 12 feet tall, it's probably just a lilac that hasn't been pruned out or thinned out over time and it's big. And so you could rejuvenate that and bring it down likely. And if it's bothering you, it's too big for you, you could certainly cut out a lot of the old wood and it would just rejuvenate and grow again.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, if you have more questions about it, Jen, You can email me or Dave. My email is hfassel@weberbasin.com. You can email me pictures if those answers didn't help you. That's all the questions that I'm seeing. And unless there's more, then I think we're good, at least for me.
Yeah, maybe if there's any other questions, please type them in quickly, or as Hattie Ann mentioned, send us an email or give us a call.
Yeah, for sure. But otherwise, I think we're good to end the class. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and hopefully you will be able to join us again for more of our classes. Make sure to keep an eye on our page. Hope we may have. Okay. Oh, thank you guys for your comments. You're welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Check out our page for more questions or for more classes, and we hope to see you there. Thanks so much, everybody. Oh, wait, before we end, Mary Jones is asking for any tips on Japanese maples. Japanese maples are a little bit tricky because they are more of a specialty type of a tree. Again, I probably wouldn't prune them other than pruning out the dead material. Do you have any personal experience with Japanese maples, Dave?
Yeah, a little bit. Japanese maples are tricky. Number one is they need to be planted in the right spot to be successful.
Right.
They are a little bit picky that way. And Hattie Ann was right. You don't want to do a lot of pruning on them unless it's a dead branch, a broken branch, or something that's just really going the wrong direction. They really don't like to be cut much. And so if you have a Japanese maple, look for those just problematic branches, and that's the only pruning you're really going to need or do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Hopefully that helps. But if there's no more questions, then we will close this class, and thank you everybody for coming.